This week we're going to talk about both the ninth and the 10th commandments because both of these commandments actually deal with the same basic issue. Namely, with how God wants us to think and feel about the stuff He gives us and the gifts that He gives to other people. The ninth commandment deals with objects, with property, and the 10th commandment deals more with relationships that God gives. The ninth commandment says, "You shall not covet your neighbor's house." What does this mean? We should fear and love God so that we do not scheme to get our neighbor's inheritance or house, or get it in a way which only appears right, but help and be of service to him in keeping it. Now, before we go on, you probably have not heard the word covet too often, so it's worth asking, what is coveting? To covet simply means to yearn for someone or something that belongs to someone else, or for something or someone that God hasn't given you. A more common word for it is envy. Now, that's not to say that every desire is forbidden by God. Not every desire counts as coveting. There are many desires that God gives us that are good, that we're supposed to have. For instance, if I see my friend eating a burrito and it makes me hungry so that I kind of want food now and maybe even a burrito, there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, it's healthy for me to desire food. The kind of desire that God is talking about with coveting is the kind that goes in hand with being discontent or being resentful. So the kind of desire that's discontent, or in other words, that refuses to be okay with what I do have. So that if I don't get what I'm hoping for, if I don't get what I desire, I refuse to be happy with the fact that I have what I have. That's discontent. Resentment is getting angry or holding on to a grudge over the fact that you don't have what you think you should have. So that I start to feel like I'm entitled to this thing that I'm desiring, and that if I don't have it, some kind of great wrong has been done to me. That's resentful, and that's the kind of desire that's covetous. So what is God commanding here in the ninth commandment? Well, first and foremost, he's telling us that we should be content with what he gives us. So that while it's fine for us to desire things we don't have, if we can't have those things, if our desires get frustrated, we should be okay with it. We should be able to live happily and satisfied with what God has given us. And in point of fact, there are people in a lot of places throughout the world who live with a lot less than we have. In fact, who don't even have everything they would need to continue living for a long time, who are short on food and water and clothing, and yet manage to be content, even in the face of the prospect of dying for not having these things. That's the kind of thing God is saying. Be okay with what he has given you. Be satisfied with him and what he ordains to offer you. Along with that goes the attitude we should have towards our neighbor's things. We should be glad to help our neighbor keep what God has given them. Now, this probably sounds a bit like the seventh commandment, where God says, "You shall not steal," and where we saw that God is dealing with things like what we do with the things God's given our neighbors and with the things God gives us. The only real difference between what God is saying in the ninth commandment and the seventh commandment is that the seventh commandment deals with our behavior, with our actions, what we actually do with the things God gives us and other people. The ninth commandment goes even deeper. It goes to your thoughts, your feelings, to your heart, and your attitude toward what God has given you and other people. And on that score, not only should we actively use our things to help our neighbor improve and protect his possessions and incomes, but in our hearts, We should desire to help our neighbor keep and protect what he has. And that also means we should be happy and grateful for the fact that God has given our neighbor what he's given him or her, and be glad and rejoice when God gives our neighbor more. Of course, we're not very good at that. We're sinners. Contentment is very much not something we're good at. Usually when we don't get what we want, or if we see somebody else getting something that we think would be nice to have, we start doing what God forbids in the ninth commandment. And what he forbids is coveting the things your neighbor owns or has. So in other words, again, like we've been saying, desiring what your neighbor has in a way where you cannot be happy with not having it, where you might even start getting angry at your neighbor and resentful towards him because he has it and you don't, thinking your neighbor doesn't deserve it, but you do, or getting angry at God for not giving it to you. A great biblical story to illustrate this is the story of Ahab and Naboth. Ahab was the king of Israel, and Naboth was a man who owned a vineyard, a place where grapes grow, that was right up against the palace that Ahab lived in. Ahab wanted the vineyard that Naboth owned, and so he went to Naboth and offered to buy it. There was nothing wrong with that. God allows us to desire things our neighbor has and to use legitimate means to see if they're willing to give it to us. Problem was, Naboth wasn't willing to sell. He said, it's been in the family too long and there's no way I could ever sell it. Now, if Ahab would have gone home and decided, okay, fine, I can't have the vineyard, I'll just move on with life, that would have been good. Problem was, Ahab started coveting it. He couldn't let it go. He started pacing up and down the halls in his house, wishing he had the vineyard and getting angry about the fact that he didn't, until he was so angry that he and his wife decided that he deserved it enough that he would make a plan to get it. He planned to throw a party and invite Naboth and a whole lot of other important people from the kingdom, and when Naboth came to the party, he would pay some people there to accuse Naboth of doing a really bad crime of treason against both God and the king. And the penalty for that was death. So the witnesses stood up, everybody believed them, they drugged Naboth out and they killed him, just like the law required. Well, you can see where the coveting led Ahab. Because now he could take the vineyard for his own as the king, and the only property owner was dead. He could pretend that he had a legitimate claim to it, and he took over the vineyard. But the coveting, that sinful desire and refusal to be content with what he had, led Ahab to break the 8th commandment by bearing false testimony against Naboth, and against the 5th commandment by having Naboth killed, and against the 7th commandment by actively stealing the vineyard by pretending to have a legitimate claim to it when he didn't. You can see how the coveting led to so many terrible sins. But the coveting itself was already a terrible sin. On top of simply forbidding us from desiring things sinfully that our neighbor has, God is also forbidding us from being discontent with what he has given us. When we don't have what we want, when we find we aren't able to get it, God says we should not be resentful about it, or feel entitled to it, or refuse to live at peace and happily and satisfied with what we have. This, again, goes right into not being resentful about what we do not have. So if I really wished I could get on the team football team and I simply don't have the skills, I should not be angry about that. I shouldn't feel entitled to it. I should instead move on with my life and be glad for the gifts God hasn't given me. Now, this also goes hand in hand with the fact that I should not desire or scheme to get what my neighbor has illegitimately. Because if I really am coveting something, chances are I'm not simply going to be stewing about it. I'm actively going to be playing out in my head ways that I might be able to get what I want. And I'll even be willing to do things that are wrong to get it. Whether I actually do those things that are wrong or not is kind of beside the point. The fact is, my heart is willing to do those things that are wrong, like Ahab with Naboth, to find a way to get what he wants, even if it's not right. Those kinds of attitudes, those kinds of desires, that kind of scheming is completely against God's will, because it shows a complete lack of regard for what God has given us and a complete lack of trust that God will take care of us and give us what we need. And above all, it shows a complete lack of respect for God by refusing to be satisfied with Him and what He chooses to give us. And what everything that we've said about in the 9th commandment and stuff goes very much in line with the 10th commandment and relationships, where God says, "You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his manservant or maidservant, his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor." What does this mean? We should fear and love God so that we do not entice or force away our neighbor's wife or workers or animals or turn them against him, but urge them to stay and do their duty. Now, you probably don't know too many people who have manservants or maidservants or oxen or donkeys. This commandment was spoken thousands of years ago in a culture where that was what the kinds of relationships a lot of people had and lived in. So this was in the terminology and in the relationships that people in those days understood. But it applies just as much to the very different kinds of relationships and roles we have in each other's lives. Whether that's as spouses, as husbands or wives, whether that's as employees or employers, whether that means our friends and our family. Whatever modern relationship we have, those are what God is talking about here. So what is God commanding in the 10th commandment? Well, we can move through these pretty quickly because it's almost identical to what God says in the 10th commandment, only now talking about relationships instead of stuff. So God is telling us that we need to be content with the people that God gives us to care for. So I should be content with my wife, with my children, with my friends, my family, and the people that God gives to me as a pastor to take care of. And I should be happy to take care of them and not wish that I had somebody else or find reasons to think that I deserve different people or people who behave differently. On the other hand, I should be content with the people that God gives to care for me, for my wife, my children, my parents, my friends, who God has put in my life as the people He sets to take care of me, to provide for me, to support me, encourage me, correct me, discipline me. I should be happy to have them. That doesn't mean, for instance, if I'm single, I can't desire a wife. Certainly I can. But if I cannot find a wife, I shouldn't be angry that I don't have a wife. I should be okay with the prospect of living single for the rest of my life, even as I work to try to find someone to marry. By the same token, I need to encourage the people that God has given to my neighbor to be faithful, to be dutiful, to be loyal to my neighbor, so that they stay and do the duties and fulfill the roles and obligations that God has given to them. So if my neighbor has a very lovely wife, for instance, or a very or if it's a girl and has a very fine looking, decent, good, upstanding husband, I shouldn't be discontent that I don't have that person as my spouse, but I should encourage them in every way I can to be a more faithful spouse, to do the duties they have as a spouse, and to be loyal to the person God has given to him or her as a spouse. So what is God forbidding in the 10th commandment? Again, pretty much the same thing he forbids in the 9th commandment, only now with relationships and people rather than stuff. So he forbids us from coveting the people that God's given to your neighbor. So if another business owner has an employee that I kind of wish I had, it would be bad for me to covet that person. Now, this is actually helpful to clear up one other point about coveting. Coveting isn't only being discontent and only being resentful about not having what God hasn't given you. Coveting also includes desiring in any way something that God has directly denied you. So, for instance, and the reason I bring this up here is this is a very clear example. Let's say my friend has a wife who is very attractive, very kind-hearted, just a wonderful person to be around. God, by joining her to my friend in the bonds of marriage, has given her only to my neighbor in a way where she and he are united forever. To desire her in any sense, even if I'm okay with not having her, even if I'm not resentful about not having her, to desire her in any sense to be my wife is breaking this commandment, because that is someone God has denied me. And so to desire what God denies is to covet and to sin. But again, going back to this list here, just like with the 9th commandment forbids us from being discontent with what God gives us, God forbids us from being discontent with who God gives us. God also forbids us from resenting the fact that we don't have the people in our life that we wish we had in our life. And finally, God is forbidding us from doing anything to scheme, to plot, to encourage people to be disloyal or unfaithful or negligent in their duties and relationships toward their neighbor. Similarly, he's forbidding us from doing anything to entice or encourage people to enter those relationships or roles with you if it leads them away from your neighbor. A very obvious example of this, again, is to say, if I were encouraging somebody else's wife to start to be disloyal to him, maybe point out the flaws in him so that they start to be less content with their marriage. Or even with boyfriends and girlfriends. If I like this girl who's dating a friend of mine, if I start talking to her in a way that I'm trying to get her to think more negatively about her boyfriend, I'm encouraging her to be disloyal. And probably for the very sinful motivation of trying to get her to rely more on me, to enter into a certain kind of relationship with me. That is all forbidden in the 10th commandment, because again, in both the 9th and the 10th commandments, God wants us to honor him as the one who gives us everything that we have and everything that we need. God wants us to trust that he will provide us with all that we need, and God wants us to be satisfied with whatever he chooses to give us or not give us.